for me, having gone to like boarding school, like it was all very bro-y, if you will. I guess when I thought about like masculinity in high school, it was like I often like looked to like kids that were like quote unquote like really cool or popular. I mean, they were really tall, worked out a lot, were like bros, played sports, like all of those different kinds of things. And so I very much kind of look to emulate a lot of those things myself, I think. And the fact that I wasn't necessarily kind of as quote unquote masculine by the way that was defined at the time, definitely did make me feel insecure.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to another podcast episode. Today I have a very special guest with me. This is Matt, my boyfriend.
Honored to be here.
So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here.
I'm so honored. I'm so excited.
I'm very excited because I feel like I've referenced you a bunch of times on the podcast. So here you are in the flesh. So I thought today we would talk a little bit about, or not a little bit, a lot about like masculinity. And I wanted to do like a little deep dive into masculinity.
Sure, of course. I don't know if I can speak for all men, but happy to share my experiences and whatever is most helpful.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
So my first question is kind of like a two-part question. I guess just starting super general, wanted to hear like your general thoughts on masculinity, and then like where you feel like you are personally in your masculinity. Got it.
No, that's a great question. I think there's kind of a lot of different forms of, I guess, masculinity. I don't know if it's necessarily kind of like a linear journey.
It's okay, you can think about it. There's a lot. And earlier today, I filmed a video, which isn't going to come out anytime soon, according to my schedule, but on like femininity and feminism. But I feel like masculinity often gets left out of the conversation. But I'm starting to like learn more about it, and I wanted to know like what you think about it, and like do you think about it? Is it something that's top of mind for you? Has it been something that has been like an explicit conversation at all?
Sure. I guess just to tackle your secondary question kind of head on, it's not something that I very consciously think about. I think I think about it in the sense that it's almost as a sense of like, because historically masculinity and like males have often like historically dominated many spaces. I guess the lens through which I think about masculinity is like as an ally for femininity or like for feminism. I think to the extent that I think about masculinity, it's often about like what are the potential perils of masculinity. So like, I mean, obviously like a very for lack of a better word, like a buzzword kind of is like toxic masculinity, and I know you talked about that on just briefly on your last pod, but that's something that I think about a lot. Like, how am I being, complicit in toxic masculinity? How do I break out of it? But also, like what role am I actively kind of playing in it, even if I don't kind of necessarily recognize that in the moment? In what ways is it toxic? I think that's something that I think about as well. Like, I think with, for example, like locker room talk and like guys on group chats and stuff, like, I think there's something that I think about is like, there's a very fine line between like what is toxic versus what is not. And that like level of subtlety and an interpretation is really, it's pretty individualistic. I know that that maybe I'm a little bit more sensitive to that versus maybe some peers that don't necessarily find as much problem with it. But I think definitely, and I'm kind of going in circles here, but I think definitely it does, masculinity, in the same way that I guess with femininity, it's definitive in that it's kind of constricting. I think that when I think about masculinity just kind of as a quote unquote like construct, it makes me feel constrained, I suppose. It doesn't, it's not a word that I would necessarily use to define who I am, but of course, you know, I identify as male, and of course it then kind of helps, it does define who I am. But it's not a word that I would actively use to try and define who I am.
Okay,
if that makes sense.
It's like a part of you, but it doesn't define you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. I have a lot of follow-up questions.
Yeah, and sorry, just to go off of that, I think I tend to think about like my identity as like, that's not one of the first descriptors. If I were to like deconstruct my identity, like that's not one of the first. Like I would say that I'm male, but I wouldn't use masculine as an adjective to describe my identity. Versus like I would definitely identify very easily if people ask me top 5 descriptors just to like a random person that didn't know you, like Asian would be one of the first things that comes up, and I think there's a little bit of a distinction there.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's dig into that.
Absolutely.
I have a lot of like little questions, but the big one is you said that if you were to describe yourself, like masculine isn't one of the top things that you would say. There's the distinction between masculine and male. And you also mentioned a couple times about masculinity being very limiting. Unpack that. Like, what does masculinity mean to you?
I don't know that I can necessarily pinpoint it with like very succinct language, but I think with everybody, when you think about masculinity, there are certain images that kind of come up, right? I think, and I'll just kind of name off some descriptors. It's like being really into sports, or being like being like, these are all kind of very traditional notions, and I kind of shy away from it. I am into sports, but probably not like super diehard fan as many others are. But in any case, like into sports, like knows how to work a grill, like loves to like grill things, lifts weights, like goes hard at the gym. What else? Like has a close group of guy friends that like the bros, the guys, the boys, which I also have. I do have that.
What do you feel like are the areas of traditional masculinity that you shy away from, or you feel like are limited by or don't define you?
It's interesting. I think as a person that identifies with the gender that has historically held many positions of power in many different societies, you don't seek to define yourself by a certain thing, whereas just as a counterexample, right, like if you're black in America, you're black in America, right? Like that's not that that's the thing that defines you, but it's because, you know, and I don't want to make any presumptions, so for those of you that are watching that are black, please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm open to learning. But my kind of outside in view is that like it isn't the thing that you seek to use to necessarily identify, but because, for example, there's such a strong community around it, because it's not necessarily the norm, because, you know, black people are still minorities, and I guess same with being Asian, right? Like being, I think when I lived in China, I don't know if you felt the same, but when I lived in China and Shanghai, like I didn't think of myself, I didn't really think about race. I didn't really think of, because I was the prevailing race, right? Like I'm Han Chinese, like what people traditionally think of as Asian. And so as somebody that's in a position that occupies a space where one of the facets that make me who I am is that kind of predominant thing. Like that's not something I seek to define myself as, and as a result of that, I think that's limiting. Although I'm sure that even for you, if you were just defined by your gender, I think that's probably that can be limiting as well. Maybe I'm wrong.
I think it's interesting what you said about like being male as almost kind of an invisible layer, right? Because like your gender is something that has afforded you a lot of privilege.
Absolutely,
right? And like being male traditionally means that like there's not as many barriers in your way. Obviously there's so much nuance to what somebody can be other than gender, but taking gender in a silo, like,
Yeah,
you don't have to think about it if you're male.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you're female, you have to think about it, and you drew the race thing. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you're white, you don't really have to think about race because there's no struggle in that. Right?
Absolutely.
Not no, but, like, if you're black, you constantly are reminded because it's
Black
a
people in
struggle.
America have had
Right.
Black people around the world really have struggled
Right.
so much.
Right.
But no, absolutely, I agree with that. That's a well put kind of summary to my very long-winded kind of rant on masculinity.
Okay. My next question is about, like, who are some role models, and I don't want to say, I don't know if role models is the right word, examples of masculinity in your life and upbringing that you feel have shaped your views on masculinity.
It's good. It's a good question. I don't know.
I can share with you.
Yeah, sure.
As you think.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I think the most classic example anybody has is their dad. If you have a dad, if you were lucky enough to grow up with a dad. And for me, like, my views growing up of masculinity were quite traditional. My dad was the breadwinner of the household. You know, he did handiwork around the house if that needed to be done. He didn't, I don't want to say he never cooked, because he did cook occasionally, but, you know, my mom was definitely the one that did most of the cooking, or my grandma. And so it was very, very traditional. And one of the things that I realize that I see as a more masculine trait, which I see in, like, the common, I don't know, common world, I guess, is, and my dad was, like, awesome. I think he breaks a lot of the, like, he was, like, a really great dad. He is a really great dad. One of the things that I feel like has been instilled in me in terms of views on masculinity, though, was anger. And I think that runs in my family pretty strongly. And, like, I see in my dad and my brother, and I know that my parents watch this, so hi fam, but, like, my dad can be a hothead sometimes, and, like, that is something that I have associated with masculinity growing up, that, like, anger is this very, very masculine trait, and I know he's not the only one that is like that.
You
know,
of course.
you see it in movies all the time. But that is something, and I see it in my brother as well, right? So I know that that's
Interesting.
a piece of where it's come from.
Interesting. So you mentioned your dad. I obviously, you know, my dad. I'm also lucky enough to have grown up with a dad whom I love. He's a great dad. But it's interesting. I feel like we've been dating for quite some time, and I feel like my views on masculinity have shifted from kind of before we started dating.
Interesting. This was going to be one of my questions.
Yeah, no. But in this, bringing it back to my dad, though, I mean, I think a lot of the same traits that you described are similar. Like, you know, doesn't really cook. I think he knows how. Doesn't really put hand to walk, if you will, to cook. Traditional breadwinner. You know, all of those things that you mentioned, and it's interesting because I think part of the reason that I shy away from being defined just by masculinity is because I think that in some ways, because that's the masculinity I grew up in, like, at least for me, I feel like it's kind of dated. And so because that's kind of my tradition, or because of that heritage that I've had, like, that's the definition by which I define masculinity. And so I kind of push back against it because I think it's kind of dated. And I guess another way of putting it would be I'm trying to redefine masculinity, but I guess I wouldn't even put it that strongly. I just kind of don't really think about it, right? I think there's a certain kind of relationship between the words. I mean, there's definitely a strong relationship between the words masculinity and kind of machismo, like being macho, for example. Hyper masculine, right? And I think we as a society has kind of moved away from that, and that's maybe because I'm kind of in this generational gap where I'm like grew up with these kind of traditional norms, but then kind of lived through an inflection point of how things change, right? Like I guess It's funny. One of my favorite movies is like 21 Jump Street, and you think about just like Channing Tatum was like really cool in high school.
Oh yeah.
Right? He was like a football player. He like got all the chicks. He was like super ripped.
Yeah.
This like crazy athlete. All these things that you think about as like traditionally like machismo or like hyper masculine. And then, you know, you skip forward like 10, 15 years later, and it's like
Things have changed.
Things have changed, right? Like it's like being sensitive, being like in touch with your feelings, being caring and kind to other people, like I mean, more on surface level, like in comic books, or like being smart, or like stuff like that.
Nerdy,
like I just think like things have changed, and maybe it's just me, but because I'm a 90s child, I very much grew up in that era, or at least, let me take a step back. I think in Asia, or at least within my upbringing in the 90s, it's kind of the norm, and maybe it is still the norm out there now, but I think with our generation, especially kind of on this side of the Atlantic, on like in the West, I think a lot of that is starting to change, or like, and I kind of want to be a harbinger of that change.
Yeah.
And so kind of push back against that traditional notion of masculinity. I think all this to say is that like, I think my dad defined a lot of the things about masculinity for me, and you know, I love my dad. I think he's carved out a great path for him. But I think for me, I kind of wanted to live a little bit differently.
Yeah.
Just like taking the breadwinner, for example. Like if, for example, like you had like a really promising position, and like for some reason, kids or whatever it is, like only one of us could work. I'd be okay with like taking a step back for a while and like letting you like, you should feel empowered to do what you need and further your career, right? Like I think, just as an example, I think that's like something that I think about.
Yeah. I think that's a good example.
Yeah. Which is all to say, I think in some ways my dad has defined masculinity for me, but it has almost been a playbook in how not to act. Not that I feel like my dad's done it wrong, it's just not necessarily for me, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. And like, both of our dads have done an awesome job, and I think one of the things that I can say for my dad, and I think your dad as well, which I don't know if this is a defining trait of masculinity, but maybe just like one step to the side of like fatherhood. And I think like, I mean, my dad and your dad also put the family first, right? And I definitely witnessed that growing up. And I don't know, I haven't put too much thought as to whether or not I've entrenched that with masculinity or just like my dad or fatherhood, where it's like he puts himself last every single time, right? It's always like the kids first when we were born, but before that it was my mom. Like always takes care of everybody else and then like takes care of himself last.
Interesting.
And that is something I've seen. I don't know if it's technically a masculine trait. I don't know if I see that a lot in men.
See, that's so interesting. Sorry, just
but it's please. Like it's something that I associate it with fatherhood.
That's fair. I think that's fair. And again, this just goes back to the way that like, as somebody that holds that is part of a group that is kind of the predominant group in power, if you will, like I don't associate that with like I don't think about necessarily like, I don't think about things in as gendered of lenses, right? Like I think that's just somebody being, I do associate it with fatherhood a bit, but I see that with my mom too, right? Like I don't necessarily associate that with like a gendered lens. Like I don't think it's like necessarily a masculine or a feminine trait.
I don't know if it is.
Maybe I don't know. Yeah, sure.
You talked about how there are like certain things where you don't feel like are as traditionally masculine. You shy away from some of those things that are hyper masculine.
Sure.
How, like, do you feel societal pressure to be more masculine? And have you now or ever felt insecure about your masculinity?
So yes to both. So I think it's very much a function of age. I think I thought about masculinity a lot more kind of in like high school, maybe even in college a bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Just because I think those are, and especially in high school, I'll say, because I think those are times where you're kind of looking out and you're not fully formed of a person yet. And I'm not saying I'm fully formed, but certainly more so than I was in high school. And I think about, you know, in high school, you're really looking for signals to like latch onto, like, who am I? Like, that's like a defining, I mean, think about all the like coming of age movies, right? Like, it's basically an entire thesis of like, who am I? And I think I very much lived through that in high school, which is also why I like those movies a lot, because they just speak to me a lot. But you're kind of just grasping at straws to figure out who are you in this kind of crazy world. And so you look for signals, right? And I think for me, having gone to like boarding school, like, I was like, oh, I have to be like really masculine, for example, like, and I certainly engaged in some like toxic masculinity as well. Like, I know we talked about this, happy to go on this later, but I was in like, the way that my boarding school worked was like, I was in like a house, kind of like Hogwarts. Exactly like Hogwarts, actually, not the magic, but like, you get put into like a house, and it's just a bunch of dudes living together. So obviously there's like a lot of like masculine energy going around. Like, it was all very bro-y, if you will. I guess when I thought about like masculinity in high school, it was like I often like looked to like kids that were like quote unquote like really cool or popular, and like, I mean, they were really tall, worked out a lot, were like bros, like, I don't know, played sports, like all of those different kinds of things. And so I very much kind of look to emulate a lot of those things myself, I think. And the fact that I wasn't necessarily kind of as quote unquote masculine by the way that was defined at the time, definitely did make me feel insecure, because I think it made me feel insecure in a couple ways, because I think I was like striving towards this thing and maybe not necessarily like just like living up to it, right? Like, I think that's one thing. I think there's also like a reward cycle, right? Like, the more masculine you are in the house, for example, kind of the more you were liked, or what it might be, right? Because you just get along with the guys more. There's also kind of a cycle with women or girls, right? A lot of high school girls are just really into like very hyper masculine dudes. Not all girls, of course, but there was kind of like a reward or incentive structure for that as well. And so like,
and it's certainly that's like in society, like,
for sure,
reward hyper masculinity.
For sure.
We're taught, girls are taught that that's what you should look for in a partner.
Exactly. But and so there's this kind of reward and incentive cycle that made me feel insecure about it. So I think there's that kind of part of my life. I think as I aged up, it's definitely something I thought less about. I think I seek to define my place in the world by like other facets of my personality, interests, career, things like that, and kind of jigsaw puzzle it together, because I knew that there was like, I started to have some sort of formation of like some more formation and building blocks of who I am, that I could build kind of a unique mosaic as opposed to like a carbon copy of something else, right? And so I looked less towards the signals and like more internally, and we talked about us dating for so long. I think that's something that I learned from you. It was just like looking internally, and that's allowed me to kind of stray away from kind of the potential insecurity with being masculine. Do I still feel it today in terms of like any sort of insecurity? I mean, of course, right? I think we're in a society where it is very much rewarded. It's funny, like, as an example, we've been working out a lot, right? And we keep making this joke, like, packs. Like, we gotta get packs, like 6 packs. Like, I think that's like frankly, I think that's like a very masculine thing, right? I mean,
well, I mean, girls have...
No. Girls definitely have 6 packs, but I think if you take 100 guys and 100 girls, the proportion of men who want six-packs...
Oh, who wants it? Yeah.
Is, and probably that who have... Six-packs.
Yeah.
I mean, just scientifically, women carry higher body fat.
Yeah.
So it is just technically harder to build a six-pack for women.
Yeah.
Right? So, like, that's, like, a very masculine trait that I'm, like, insecure that I don't have. But is it, like, really detrimental to my, like... Is it, like, debilitating, or is it, like, really detrimental to, like, my formative identity? I don't think so, but, like, it's certainly, like, it still niggles. Naggles? What is... I don't know.
Okay, yeah.
It still kind of permeates my thoughts, is the kind of...
the official
the
word.
official way to say it.
I like niggles.
Niggles, yeah.
So how do you feel like that transformation happened from high school to where you are now? Because, I mean, not to say that you're like 100% right now, but to your point, it feels like there's been a shift from seeing people in high school who were hyper-masculine and wanting those things. And maybe there are some things like six-packs that we still want today, but it's not as, like, top of mind. Are there any, like, was there one moment or any key moments that you feel like really changed your point of view and helped you get over, at least in part, any of that insecurity?
I don't know if there's, like, a moment. I think it's definitely, like, a gradual shift. But I think it just, for me, it was a couple of things. I think for me, it was, like, just due to, like, aging and, like, growing up. I keep saying aging as if I'm really old. But, like, part of just, like, growing up is, like, learning who you are beyond these kind of traditional, or at least for me, it's been learning about, like, who I am beyond these kind of traditional confines. And so that's just one natural kind of through line. I think another one is, like, just the nature of our relationship, right? Like, we've been dating for, like, 7 years. And, like, I do think that I would probably try to skew to be more quote-unquote masculine if we weren't dating. But I think, like, it very much has to do with the incentive structure as well, right? Like, I think...
Because, like, you have me already?
Well, I think that's part of it.
There's not as much of a need to be that masculine?
I mean, that's part of it, but, like, just as an example, right? I think, like, when you're first dating, like, when you first start dating, like, those are important... Or those are signals that, like you said, I think women traditionally are, like, looking for. But I think as a relationship evolves, like, is it that important to you that I'm that masculine? It becomes less important, right? So it's both the fact that, like, there's less of a need for me to be masculine, but also because, like, I've signaled to you that like,
I am indeed a man.
I'm a man. And so there's that, but there's also the fact that, like, needs change, right? Like, as you're in a long-term relationship, like, the need to be sensitive, empathetic, like, all of these things that aren't traditionally masculine, those things become more important, and that's kind of been, like, liberating for me to also not feel the need to be as quote-unquote masculine. Those are, like, two clear through lines. I think the third, so it's kind of like a personal level, like a relationship level, very consultant framework, but, like, there's also, like, a societal thing, right? Like, I think we just lived through a shift. I just remember, like, just as an example, right? Like, I think both because of, like, the culture we were living through, but also the culture we were living through, the environment I was in, but also just, like, me trying to, like, figure out who I am. Like, I remember in high school, like, me and my friends would, like, kind of catcall girls, like, out of, like, our dorm rooms, because, like, you could see, like, our house was, like, closest to, like, the girls' dorms, and so, like, girls would, like, walk to class, and we'd, like, catcall them, like, not in a, like, in retrospect, obviously, I mean, not obviously,
not cool.
I mean, it's not cool, but, like, it may be, I don't want to presume, but it probably was not, I don't want to presume the feelings of how those girls felt, but there is cause for them to not feel comfortable with that at all. And so, I mean, that's obviously my bad. if any of you are watching this, I'm sorry.
No, I think it's cool for you to talk about it now, though, because we're not, like, we don't know these things when we're young, right?
But that's the thing. I feel like kids now know it more.
That's true.
Right? Like, I think it's being brought into the consciousness, which is what I wanted to talk about with the third through line. Like, I just think about these things, like, it's just come to, like, public attention more, like to the credit of, like, all the feminists out there that have, like, brought this to, like, public opinion, public attention. Like, that's kind of made me reflect on what it means to be masculine, and A, is it important? B, can it be toxic, right? Like, that's not even something I thought about in high school. And so I think that's the third thing that's kind of helped me kind of have a little bit of, like, a mental shift, kind of away from, like, the norms of masculinity.
That's really interesting.
Sorry, one other thing that I am insecure about with being masculine, and you know this from our recent experiences, is just how much of a non-handyman I am. Like, that's something I'm pretty embarrassed about.
Really?
I'm kind of embarrassed about it.
Okay.
I don't know, like...
I feel like you, maybe within the last year, have grown so much in terms of, at least from an outward perspective, I don't feel like you are as uncomfortable with it, with not being handy. Because I think about a year ago, like, we had an experience at my house where I was doing something and you wanted to, like, it was like with the wall anchors in my closet, putting back up the rod that fell. Basically, we had to go buy a wall anchor and then put it in and whatever, right? And, like, I grew up with my dad being really handy, and, like, not to say I'm super handy, but between the two of us, like, I'm handier than you.
For sure, for sure.
And so, like, I remember you not being, like, super happy about that, or just you felt a little bit of discomfort with me doing that. But, like, now as we're redoing this place, like, we're both learning a lot.
We're learning a lot.
We're learning a lot, but I feel like I don't feel that same sense of discomfort from you.
That's fair.
You can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And I think part of it is all of those things that I talked about before. But also part of it is, like, realizing that, like, who cares? Like, I mean, it like, obviously you still care because you think about it. But, like, if you really dig deep, it's like, who cares? Especially because, like, I have you on my quote-unquote team, right? Like, we're teammates. Like, it's great that somebody can do it in the house, right? Like, I think... like, that's maybe the way to think about it. It's like breaking your individuality a little bit, to think about, like, does it really matter that you're the person doing it? As, like, if you think just from, like, a utilitarian perspective, you need to get this thing fixed, does it matter who does it? Not really, right? Like, it's great, you got it fixed. And, like, I think just thinking about that, it's like, does it matter? Not really.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. But thank you for fixing it, because I certainly didn't know how.
But I do feel like we've learned so much.
We've learned
about
so much
handiwork. We changed a chandelier that we thought we might need an electrician, but we didn't.
We drilled holes.
We drilled
in our
holes.
Ceiling.
We, like, did the wiring. We took down this, like, intensely heavy chandelier.
Okay, let's take a step back. You did the wiring.
Okay, I did the wiring.
I took down the very heavy chandelier.
But, like, teamwork. We couldn't have done it without each other.
For sure. I mean, I'm still not an electrician, but, you know.
We're getting there.
We're getting there.
We're getting there. We still have lights to fix.
We do have lights to fix.
On this kind of, like, relationship note.
Okay.
Let's talk about movies. So there's a scene in Crazy Rich Asians.
Okay.
Which, if you haven't seen the movie, where have you been? But also, spoiler alert. When Astrid and her husband kind of have that falling out, basically.
In the car.
Not in the car. When she goes back to their home. And she's packing up her things, and she's leaving. And she has this punchline where, like, they have this conversation, and he's like, oh, where are you gonna live? And she's like, I own 14 complexes around here, probably one of those places. And they just have these, like, punchy lines towards each other, and she says, it's not my job to make you feel like a man, right? And then she walks away.
Yep, I remember that.
Thoughts on that?
I mean, I think she's right. Right? Like, but, like, I think she's right. But also, like, I just question, why is there such a strong desire to feel like and what does that really mean? Right? I think those are just, like, social norms. And I don't want to sound like, oh, I'm better than social norms and I transcend all of this, like, right? Like, but, like, that's not what I'm trying to say, but if I really think about it, like, she's right, because if I think about, like, what is quote unquote masculine, beyond all of those surface things that I talked about, it's like words that come to mind are like self-actualization, self-preservation, perseverance. None of those things have to do with another person and how they make you feel, right? Like, all of those things are like self-initiated, but again, also be like, I don't know, why do they necessarily need to feel? I get it, but also, I don't know.
I mean,
he's being quite sensitive about it.
I think
but being honest,
I think they're a really extreme example,
for
right?
sure,
because she's obviously like the breadwinner, and she was also born into a lot of money. Like, he actually was a self-made man. He was an entrepreneur. He had a good business. He just like couldn't live up to her level of wealth, right?
Yeah.
And that was just like, it was just on the wealth topic for them. But and then like he cheated on her because I don't know, because that's what he did.
Because he's an idiot.
Because he's an idiot. Come on. But like, I think in a smaller scale, or in like a smaller example, like, feminism has gotten a bad name for being people who like absolutely reject any sort of masculinity, right? So like, what if I was like, don't open doors for me? Things like that, where I guess my question is about taking away from masculinity, whether it's that example of like making more money, which is one thing, or like being more handy. Like, how do you feel about women in this case uber stepping into those roles of masculinity, and does that take away from a man's masculinity?
Sure. I guess it's not something that I've necessarily experienced, and I think that's a testament to our relationship, is like, we're very balanced individuals. I think in some ways I'm more feminine than you, and in other ways you're more masculine than I.
It's the same thing, but yes. Sorry.
if
we're talking about a binary, then yes.
If you exactly. I don't know. That's an interesting question, right? Because I thought about the hypothetical of, I don't want to say that it wouldn't bother me, because I think that it would, but not because it's quote unquote taking away from my masculinity necessarily, but like, I think maybe it is. I don't know. I think there's let's just play this out in like a real example, right? So like, you become like an executive at like a Fortune 500 company or whatever, or you start your own business and you're like uber successful, and like, we end up having kids, and like somebody needs to rear those children, right? I think I would be very okay like stepping back and like rearing those children, but then I think about, it's not that like my pride is hurt, or that like, oh, like I'm not the breadwinner, like I have anxiety around that. I think it's more that like, because it's not the norm, many of my friends may be working, and so it's just like, it's not that it impacts my pride, but it impacts my connection to other men. As an example, right? And maybe that's masculinity. I don't know if I'm apt enough to define that, but it's not like a slight on my honor, or like an impact to how I feel, or my self-worth, but it's the shared experiences I have with other men, because I very much value my male friendships as well as my female friendships. But I think you talk about female friendships a lot on this pod, and I think there's like there's something really great about male friendships as well, right? Especially just, well, non-toxic male friendships, right? So in that sense, it would niggle at me a little bit. But I don't know, is that Does that make sense? I don't know how to quite verbalize it.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think it speaks to just like the importance of us as a society just having more diversity in roles.
Absolutely.
In, like, gender fluidity and representation.
For sure.
I think if we were to play the scenario out, if like half of your friends maybe, or like half of the male population were stay-at-home dads, then it wouldn't niggle at you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And I think there's also something with like marriage and gender roles that also is an important thing to highlight in that scenario, right? Like the kids are young, you're probably taking them to like preschool or like a nursery, or really young, like you're taking them to like mom meets basically, right? And like I think traditionally, and I think you and I somewhat subscribe to this, but I feel like you maybe subscribe to it more than I do. Like I think that like the men and women shouldn't get too close when you're in like a serious relationship thing.
Yeah, I definitely subscribe to that more.
Because it's not just because in that scenario, right? It's not just that I'm no longer have as much shared context as like my friends, like like maybe they're talking about like, I don't know, we were like watching some horrible bosses, like they were complaining about their bosses, and I'm just like, well, my kids are, you know, just like crayons everywhere, right? Like that's not like necessarily a shared topic. So you lose out on that, but on the other hand, you also lose out on really deep friendships because of this other norm that you hold, that we hold, of like, you know, when you're in a long-term relationship, and certainly when you're married, like it can be a little bit dicey, thank you, to be really close to
somebody of the opposite sex.
I don't know.
Heterosexual.
That's exactly the thing, though. I don't know that I necessarily ascribe to that, because I think we are moving in a world that is no longer defined by binary gender roles. So like I don't like, what if somebody's right, like
I agree.
This is a whole other conversation, but like I think what I'm trying to say is not only does it take away from the shared context of your male friendships, but you also are, in my scenario or in our scenario, not as able to build those strong relationships with other females, with females that occupy the space of rearing children, for example. Just in that scenario, in that made up hypothetical
scenario.
I mean, how do you, like, let me flip the question back to you. I know I'm not beginning with you, but like,
that's okay.
How do you perceive, from an outside-in perspective, like my relationship with masculinity? And I think broader than that, how do you... So I think that's question A. Question B is, how do you perceive that my relationship with masculinity has changed throughout our relationship? I mean, it's the same through levels, but like, how has society changed, right? Like, I'm curious to hear from like a female perspective how those things have evolved.
I think it's quite on par with what you described for yourself. And I don't think yours is like too unique of an experience of just growing up and growing slightly out of toxic masculinity, although not entirely. I do think with what you said earlier, just being in a relationship helps a ton, because I think like, sorry,
can we take a step back? I don't want to say helps, because I think that takes the presumption that masculinity is bad.
Toxic masculinity.
Toxic masculinity.
Yeah, it helps with like toxic masculinity.
Sure, yeah.
I think.
I agree.
But I think like we were friends for a little bit before we started dating. But even observing like other male friends, I think around our like high school years, everybody engages with or is victim to toxic masculinity. And I remember seeing you and hearing you like make certain remarks, and I was just like, ugh. But as we started dating and like we both grew up a little bit more, I started noticing things changing. And I think also there were a lot more societal message of like putting a name to toxic masculinity and being able to identify what it was, which helped. So I do see change. And I don't think it was like a big change from the beginning of when we were dating. And
there's not like a moment, right?
Yeah, or anything. Like, I still think that change is very much happening. And we talked about like the handiwork around the house. I think that has to do with it too. But yeah, like it's all like positive change, I think.
For sure. I think the other thing that, as you were talking, first of all, thank you. The other thing that I had thought of, I mean, they say that you're kind of you said this on your last pod too, but like you're kind of the product of the people around you, right? So I think that obviously makes sense, right? Like you're influencing me. But I think there's also something to be said about, I think there's something to be said about these norms being reinforced in group settings, right? And I know you and Vivian in the last pod, if you guys haven't heard the last pod, definitely check it out. The link will be here or here or here or here.
Or if you're listening in
in the show notes. But I think there is something about these, it's not just masculinity, but I presume femininity as well. Like these things tend to get enforced more readily and easily in groups. And while I do have a very close kind of guy friend group, I didn't like go to school with them necessarily. Like I went to middle school with them, and then like this boarding school is kind of very complicated. But like I like saw them once in a while, but like I wasn't like deeply entrenched. And then it was like in college that we got closer. I think I always grew up as kind of like a floater, what I call a floater. Like you guys talked about this too, right? And so like that engendered more like one-on-one relationships, one-on-one friendships, which did two things for me. I think I didn't necessarily think as much in like the masculine lens because of that. Like you start to think of yourself as an individual, as like versus a group of guys, right? It's like there's Matt walking down the street versus the boys, right? Like you think of yourself more as an individual as opposed to like as a part of a whole in the system. So I think that's A. I think B, it also just allowed me to have more female friends, right? Like one-on-one kind of female friends, and like the capacity and like the opportunity to like hang out with them on an individual basis has also been instrumental in my understanding of masculinity. So I just like connecting to the last pod, I think there's like themes there as well. Sorry, I kind of cut you off. You talked about how I have changed, but like society as a whole, like how, and I guess the question I'll throw back to you is like, you mentioned that you talk a lot of, you think a lot about femininity and feminism. And you've started to think about like masculinity more. Like what are some of those thoughts? What does masculinity mean for a woman of the 21st century?
Interesting question.
Got to throw the hard questions back. She's been asking some excellent questions.
I'll be honest with you, the way that I started thinking about masculinity was because I was frustrated with men not being interested in feminism. And I thought, how do I get men interested in feminism? And the answer to that was what affects men personally. Toxic masculinity. And that's something that like the feminist narrative talks about a lot. So I started digging into that a little bit more, and you know, there's a lot of like common tropes about toxic masculinity. But I just like masculinity as a whole, like I am so much more interested now into digging into how men define that and like how important it is to them, right? Which gets into like what I asked about insecurities and like growth and things like that. But for me, I still think that I'm very much on my own journey in defining and redefining what masculinity is, because I've grown up on all of those same ideas of toxic masculinity, right? And I watched a video the other day where they referenced this documentary that I haven't watched yet, but the nugget from it was that masculinity is often defined in 3 terms, which is athleticism, money,
Thought about that.
and
Thought about
sex.
that. Thought about that.
Right? And so those are like the 3 pillars of masculinity.
We hit it. We
Right?
hit it in the pod. We did it.
Which was really interesting to me. And like I said, I actively now try to like not define it by those 3 things. But I think it's difficult. Like you see a guy with a really built body and you're like, oh yeah, that's a man. That's what you're taught to think.
Sure.
And so I think in the last like year or so, I'm trying to like, okay, there are so many more bodies out there on guys, and shout out to our other pod, Retainer Talk, which may or may not get released. We do have an episode where we talk about body image.
Male body
image.
More specifically.
Yeah. But it's still a journey for me. I don't really know how I define it. I still think that I have so many of those ingrained notions that I've grown up on that I'm trying to get rid of. Yeah,
I think that's fair. I think what I'm interested in thinking about also is like how culture affects definitions of gender norms, right? Like I think part of the reason that I wouldn't necessarily define myself as like very masculine is because I think that I have associated the word masculinity with like a very hyper-specific breed of like American masculinity. I guess I just don't view myself as like that brand of masculine. And I'm curious. I mean, I've lived here for so long, but I'm curious like what other like cultures kind of think and feel about the definitions of those topics, but also like the need to adhere to the norms of their specific definitions.
Yeah, I mean, you think about like K-pop and how that
that's
changed
actually
the
example that I was like bringing up. Right, like men wear makeup, it's fine.
Yeah, and like in China, men hold the women's purses.
Yeah,
that's not a thing that we see here, but
exactly.
Yeah, I can't speak to what the norms are, what the feelings are, but that is really interesting, and I wonder if men feel like, oh my gosh, I need to hold her bag or else I'm not a man.
And that's fair. I think the international, like our, just like bringing this back to like culture and kind of upbringing, I think that at least for me, and maybe it's similar for you, but like I think like we think about like the just the bag example and like we're just like, well, that's ridiculous.
Like,
that's hilarious, right? Like I think because I've lived in multiple contexts, like I can think about it may be I think it is very much a norm in China.
Yeah.
But like if you were if you were an alien, for example, looking down, you'd be like, well, that's ridiculous. And I think very much the same as like American traditional norms. And it's like if you were an alien, you would also be like, well, like why are you valued because you like, I don't know, like because of like the things that you said necessarily, right? I mean, maybe athleticism, historically, if you're more athletic, your chances of survival are greater. Like that doesn't apply anymore, right? Like stuff like that. Like I think if you were an outside in person, like you just have the ability to think about like, and I'm not saying I'm immune to it, but like you are afforded the opportunity to think about like outside of this context, like if you don't know this context as like something that's necessarily as inherent in you, and so because of that it's not second nature to you is what I'm trying to say. To me, it just like those are kind of just like constructs that
it's like who decided that
who
was
decided that I mean like our ancestors decided
I mean,
that,
people
right?
decided,
but like
why is
if
that
you take
still...
a step back, like I don't know, like you don't need to be beholden to these things, and that's something that I'm really grateful for like my international experience. I probably sound like the most pretentious person that's ever been on this pod.
Boarding school,
international school does not ascribe to any sort of norms, apparently. But like, I don't know, you just start thinking in that way where it's like, it doesn't really matter.
All right, so I feel like we've been talking for a good amount of time.
Yeah, wow.
So, closing question. If you had some sort of message, words of encouragement, words of advice for young males, and I'm pretty sure there are no young males watching this, but let's pretend, like your younger self, what would you tell them knowing what you know now?
We talked about kind of ideas of how like females view masculinity versus males view masculinity and kind of the importance of those. And I guess I would just encourage my younger self or younger viewers to seek the female perspective and like engage in these topics. That's the best way, honestly, like is to get diverse perspectives on this topic. Because I think, you know, if you're hanging out with a bunch of guys and talk about, first of all, I don't know that a bunch of guys would necessarily just automatically engage on the topics of masculinity, but that's also something to do, is like talk to your male friends about
about it.
Have real talks with your male friends about masculinity, but also seek diverse perspectives. You know, speak to women about how they feel about masculinity, how they define masculinity, speak to those that are non-gender binary conforming about masculinity and the role that it might play in their lives, and the same with femininity. I think that's the best, because I think the world is always changing, and I think there's something to be said about like imparting knowledge on a younger generation, and like me having lived through some of that stuff, right? It's important to share some of that knowledge, and I think we've shared a lot of our perspectives on the pod, but I think there's also something about just like learning from peers and like understanding where society is at today, to understand, you know, what are things that are societal norms that you are glad has moved on from when we were young, and what are things that still need to be changed, and how is your generation changing it? So definitely, I would encourage you to do that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the time. Thank you for sharing your insights and stories.
Yeah, no, honored to be on the pod.
Yeah.
This was fun. This was like our first, this is our first recorded pod, or first video recorded pod, I should say. We've done retainer talk. Which may or may not get released. Retainer talk is basically like a pod that we do.
It's just a silly pod.
It's a silly pod. We just talk about random topics and do little skits. Yeah,
if you want to listen to that, it may or may not be linked down below. Lots of may or may nots. But yes, thank you for being here.
Yeah.
For those watching or listening, thanks for watching or listening. Let us know in the comments if there was anything interesting that spoke to you, or if you want to see us talk about something else, we would do that. I'll happily have this guy back. And thanks again. See you in the next one.